All right, take out your note packet, please. We got a bunch of notes to do.
1980 version with some like headband guys with his like kingdom like mask, What are we taking out?
Your notes. All right, we actually, you guys, we didn't quite get to what we needed to, so we got a lot to do here.
Yes.
Are we now going to go work speed 5?
Yesterday we left off at the very end of this slide. We were talking about scientific names, binomial nomenclature, and we talked about these bears, and they're closely related because they're in the same genus. And then we were just finishing up by talking about the rules for writing a binomial name, a scientific name. And so remember, the scientific name is made up of the genus as the first word, the species is the second word. We capitalize the genus, we lowercaseify the species, and then we write it in italics if we're on the computer, or we underline it. Sorry, I'll go back. Or we underline it if you're just writing it by hand. So that's how we write it properly. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about for most of today are a little bit about what a species is, and now we're going to start to get into the 6 kingdoms and the characteristics and examples of all 6 of the kingdoms of living organisms. Okay? So let's talk for a minute about a species. So when we start with domain, the top level group, there's millions of species in every single domain. But then as we go down to kingdom, we have fewer species. And phylum, we have fewer and fewer. Once we get down to species, how many types of organisms are in a species? Yeah, just really one type of thing. That's the most specific. Okay, so what determines if 2 things are the same species or not? Let's think about an example. Is a Chihuahua and a Golden Retriever, are they the same species?
No.
Yes.
So there's always so how many will say yes? A Chihuahua and a Golden Retriever are the same species. So yes, we're saying yeses here? Okay, how many think no, they're different species?
No,
How many people aren't really sure?
Okay, yeah,
Pretty sure they're not.
All right, so the question is, are they the same species or not? So we would call them dogs. They obviously have some differences. They look quite different from each other. How do we know if they're the same species? Does anybody have any idea about that, Jonathan?
They're the same type of animal?
Yeah, well, they are. But how will we know for sure, Jonathan?
The last name of their binomial nomenclature
Okay,
is the same.
if we knew their scientific names,
What?
we could
Wait, what was that?
we could see if they have the same species name. How is that determined though? So a species, 2 things are the same species. There's a criteria here. If they can,
Oh, I was gonna say DNA.
we could analyze DNA. That would tell us how similar they are. But what it comes down to, Courtney?
Maybe their bone structure?
No, it has to do with reproduction.
If they can.
If they can reproduce, if they can mate, and produce offspring that are fertile, they're considered to be the same species. So, based on what you know about dogs, anyone change their mind now?
Yeah. Yes.
Is a Chihuahua and a Golden Retriever the same species?
Yes.
They are. All breeds of dogs are technically capable of interbreeding with each other. That's where we get things like a Labradoodle, which is a lab poodle.
I have a Labradoodle.
So that's a lab as one parent, a poodle is the other parent. They're 2 different breeds of dogs, but they can still mate, they can still reproduce, they can still have offspring, okay? And those offspring are fertile. So yes, all breeds of dogs are actually the same species. Jonathan?
Is it the same with cats?
Yeah, different breeds of cats are the same species as well. Joey?
I'm getting a puppy.
All right, what kind? Okay. Yorkie is a Yorkshire Terrier and a Poodle. Oh, okay. So anyway, yeah,
So
those,
guess what? Nobody
all those
cares.
different breeds, Eli, be quiet. All those various breeds, those like sort of fancy mixes of animals come from two purebred dogs that are mated together, and they can produce offspring. The offspring are fertile. So that's our definition of a species. Okay? A species is a group of members that can interbreed. And we have to add a little section on that I don't have up there, but I want you to add. Can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And produce fertile offspring. And we need to add that because of this next topic, which are hybrids.
Wait, and produce what?
Fertile offspring. Because there are instances when two different species can reproduce and have offspring, even though they're separate species. Now, it cannot be a cat and a dog reproduce and have some dog-cat thing. They have to be what? The two different species have to be very closely related. Definitely in the same family. Usually it's in the same genus even. So they're two very closely related species, but sometimes they will reproduce and have young. But often, almost always, their young are infertile and can't reproduce on their own. Okay? So that's why we add that section in there. So a hybrid is offspring from two different species. Most of the times, these hybrid offspring do not occur in nature. Often they occur in captivity, at zoos, on farms, in aquaria. But sometimes they do happen in nature as well. And so we'll talk about a few of these.
Do like the hybrids have to be like not fertile?
Yeah, they're almost, sometimes they can be fertile, rarely, but usually they're not. So, probably the most common example is an agricultural animal that's been bred. It's when a donkey is crossed with a horse. Donkey is Equus asinus. The horse is Equus cabala. So again, they're closely related. They're still in the same genus. They're just two different species. But they can produce an offspring. You know what we call it?
A zebra.
Yeah, a mule. A mule is a hybrid. Mules cannot reproduce. They're not fertile. They're sterile.
Wait, so mules?
Nope.
What?
Mules can't reproduce.
Do we write
So they're
mule
dead.
and donkey the same thing?
No, they're two different things.
For a minute, I thought it was going to create a zebra, so I was like, why does the false killer whale and the bottlenose dolphin make a female horse?
All right, so another example, this happens sometimes in aquariums. A false killer whale and a bottlenose dolphin, they form a hybrid offspring. It's called a wholphin.
A wolf.
And most of these are actually named. The male parent species is the first part, so the whale, and the female parent species is the second half of their name.
Is it actually a thing?
Yeah. Just like a male lion and a female tiger, same genus, two different species. Yes, they do form a liger as a real animal.
Oh my god.
It's a hybrid. The other thing you'll notice, if you look at this picture of this liger, often hybrids are much larger in size than either of the parent species. It's this thing called hybrid vigor, where hybrids are often much bigger and larger than the two parents. So yeah, that is a liger. That's one in captivity.
It's like a horse.
So
all hybrids can't do it?
there's a couple exceptions, but almost always, yes.
How come mule looks like a horse?
So the zebra and the horse, again, both in the horse genus, Equus, they form a zorse.
That looks really
A
cool.
zorse is real, yeah.
That is really.
There's a lot of these horse hybrids. The Equus genus is capable of lots of interbreeding. They're called zebroids. Is when these the zebra can form hybrids with lots of other species. Here's here of some other hybrids that are kind of interesting to see. This one once in a while will happen in nature, but often it's in captivity in a zoo or something. If you have a polar bear and a grizzly bear produce an offspring, it's called a growler bear. And this is it's larger than either parent. This is the hybrid.
It's so cool. It's like half white.
Oh God.
I'm about to tell you. Just let me finish. This is a
Fox and a cat.
this is a savanna cat. It is a domestic cat, and it forms a hybrid with a serval, which is an African wildcat, and forms this offspring. People breed them. People do have them as pets and stuff. Some of what I've read is that these savanna cats they sort of behave much like a dog, where you can walk them, put on a leash, and they'll follow you around the house and stuff. I don't know too much about them, but that's what that is. Chloe? Oh, really? Did you like walk around the neighborhood?
My cat goes on a leash too.
This is a sheep goat. It's a cross between a sheep and a goat. Sometimes, I guess, forming agriculture. This is a cross between a domestic cow and a buffalo or bison. It's called a beefalo. And they really are used in agriculture for meat. Some of these beefalo hybrids, they are fertile. So that's why I keep saying mostly and almost always. Sometimes they are for the autumn.
When we were in Yellowstone, there was we were going down this road and there was a bunch of bison in front of our car. It was pretty creepy because I thought of the State Farm commercial where they hit the car.
State Farm commercial.
Jonathan?
Is polar bear more dangerous than the polar bear?
I don't know, that's equal. This is a zonkey. The zebra zonkey.
It's so
No.
adorable.
Why is the horse and barking to come on?
I don't know. That's because it was named long ago before they had these names. All right. So we have a bunch of notes to do today about our 6 kingdoms. So we're going to talk just about, we'll list them all. We'll talk about some general characteristics and talk about some examples. So, before I get there, you guys mentioned earlier with the song, said did I talk about domain?
Yeah.
Why they didn't include it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. But anyway, that's a more modern thing. And when we get to these kingdoms, we used to learn, like when I was in elementary school, you learned 5 kingdoms, okay? Because one of the groups is sort of separated out later on. We'll talk about that. But here's our 6 kingdoms, and some are probably familiar. Did you guys ever have to learn the kingdoms?
Wait, Mr. Durrell says 5 up there.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. So first off, the one we can
Bacteria.
we know easily is this one. Yes. Feel free to shade in some clothes on this guy. I don't know why he's not wearing anything, but give him some shorts and a shirt or something. He's not having a good day. The bird's pecking him in the head. The fish is biting him in the side. The snake's about to attack him, and the mouse is just looking at him awkwardly. Maybe because he's not wearing his clothes. But anyway, animal kingdom is one I'm sure we're all familiar with. But it includes things sometimes people forget, like insects are animals, worms are animals, even sponges and jellyfish and clams. Those are all in the animal kingdom. How about this group? We all know this one. Yeah, the plant kingdom, the cactus and the radish and the tree.
Cacti.
Plant kingdom. So we have animals.
Mushrooms.
We have plants. John, do you have a question?
Is that what it's called? That place
Yeah. These also do have Latin names. We're not using them. Animalia, plantae, and so forth. But we're just using sort of English equivalents. I've been called this before, this group. Yeah. Fungi.
So that is Latin, isn't it?
Yeah. Fungi. So this includes mushrooms, slime molds, mold,
Is that Latin?
And
Fungi? Because
yeah,
like
that is
I is
yes.
yeah.
Now this group is one we're going to spend a fair amount of time on when we're done with this section. These are called protists. They're we'll talk about that kingdom later on. We'll talk about it. And then our last two are sort of in this category. What have we not included yet? That is live, but sort of doesn't fit anywhere else. Yeah, bacteria. The Latin name is Monera, Kingdom Monera, but we'll call them bacteria. And then, so that used to be the end of it for lots of people. There were 5 kingdoms. And eventually those scientists, after some research, realized that there's one group that was kind of lumped in with bacteria that are actually quite different and don't really belong in the same kingdom. That's called archaea. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit about them at the end of today. But it's another kingdom of unicellular organisms.
Whoa, that's a really it's spelled
All right,
really
so
weird.
we're going to talk about our kingdoms, and we're going to talk about some criteria that we use to sort species into the proper kingdom. And so we're going to look at 3 main things. How many cells they have, how they get nutrition, and their nucleus. Okay? Now, when we studied cells, a couple months ago, we drew the cells and we looked at things. They all had a nucleus, but there are cells that do not have a nucleus. Their DNA is not enclosed in a membrane like the cells we talked about, but it's just sort of scattered throughout the cytoplasm. And this is a major distinction. Okay, and we have some words for this. First, we always talk about the roots of words and prefixes. This prefix pro, like in a book, where would you find the prologue? The prologue. It's like before, the main part of the story starts. Pro means before. The prefix u, that means true. And then this root, karyo, means having to do with the nucleus, the chromosomes. And so if you put those parts together, you end up with these 2 words, prokaryote or eukaryote. All of the organisms that we are studying are either prokaryote or eukaryote. So what do you think prokaryote means? Joey? Yeah, so what would that mean?
Like a nucleus, and like when it was first developed.
Sort of. These were things that evolved before nuclear membranes had formed. So yeah, these are things without a nuclear membrane, where the DNA, again, is just scattered throughout the cytoplasm. These are generally very simple cells. They don't have complex organelles. Versus the other ones, eukaryotes, which are the ones we were drawing and looking at with the microscope. Eukaryotes are more complex. They do have a nuclear membrane surrounding the chromosomes. So that's the two different types of criteria related to the nucleus. We also can talk about how many cells make up a living thing. And we have 2 categories, unicellular or multicellular. Raise your hand if you can tell me, what does unicellular mean? Cole? Yeah, these are single-celled organisms made of just a single cell. Versus multicellular, which are many cells. And then we talk about how does it get energy. Things are either autotroph or heterotroph. What is an autotroph? Troph means food. Auto means self. Morgan? Yeah, they make their own food. What process did we learn about?
Photosynthesis.
Yeah. Organisms make their own food through photosynthesis.
Isn't there like this one episode of SpongeBob?
Photosynthesis.
Yeah, where they were talking about like photosynthesis.
Maybe.
I don't know, I was like, I don't know.
And on the other side, we have heterotrophs. How do they get energy?
It's so small, I want you to
How do heterotrophs get energy? So autotrophs make their own food molecules. Jonathan?
They would have to like get energy from like a source, like eating food.
Yeah, they have to eat other things to get energy. It could help you to remember, if you remember the H, they have to hunt for food, you could say. And also, just to go back for a minute, people sometimes have trouble remembering prokaryote versus eukaryote. The one way I tell people to help remember, pro rhymes with no. Prokaryotes have no nucleus. U, for eukaryote, U rhymes with do, because eukaryotes do have a nucleus. So pro, no, U, do. All right, so let's go through our kingdoms and talk about some of their characteristics. First ones are fairly easy because we're all very familiar with these kingdoms. The animal kingdom is the largest. It has the most species that have been identified. So let's start with cells. How many cells? What word would you use to describe animals? Bianca?
Multicellular.
Yeah, they're multicellular. How about their nucleus? What word would we use to describe animals? Nicole? They're eukaryote, correct. We saw when we drew our cells, when we looked at our cheek cells, there's a nucleus there. Nuclear membrane surrounding genetic material. How about obtaining energy? What word would we use for animals? Courtney? Yeah, they're heterotrophs. Good. Animals have to eat stuff to get energy. So, there's many, many examples. We'll just list a few.
Why a spider?
Why not a spider?
Looks like a cave. Not a spider.
All right, plants. Plants are fairly easy, I think, as well. So, all those, why don't we look at this? How about number of cells? Marshall?
Multicellular?
Yeah, they're multicellular. You can imagine a tree out there or a tomato plant. They're made of many cells. How about nucleus? Eli?
Eukaryote.
They're eukaryotes. They do have a nucleus, correct. How about obtaining energy? Joey? Yeah, they're autotrophs. They go through photosynthesis. They have chloroplasts. So, trees and apples and moss, all sorts of things are plants.
Cactus is fungi, right?
No.
Cactus is a plant.
Oh.
The second was one of the examples on the last page.
All right. So now we start to get into some maybe less familiar territory. So fungi. So fungi are include mushrooms. That's probably the one you're maybe most familiar with, but also some other things. Mold, slime molds. Fungi are multicellular, but there is a unicellular fungus as well. There's several. Does anyone know what it is? You've probably experienced it this year in school, probably in home and careers. You've used this fungus.
Flowers?
Bianca? Yeast. Yeah, yeast is a fungus. Why do you put it in with the flour and water and stuff when you're making your pizza dough? Olivia? Yeah, what does anyone know what's actually going on? So you add this living thing, the single-celled fungus, to your flour, and eventually your dough rises. Jonathan, what's
I think
happening?
it's digesting the flour and then passing down.
Yeah, the yeast is consuming sugars from the dough, and one of the waste products, as it does that, is carbon dioxide. It releases that carbon dioxide, which what happens in the dough? Yeah, it forms little bubbles in there, and that's why the dough rises, because those little bubbles are filled with carbon dioxide. Basically, it's the waste gas of this organism. Okay, and so that's what causes the dough to rise.
So it's like burping out.
Basically, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and when you slice into a loaf of bread or something, each little bubble in there was where there was some carbon dioxide trapped from digestion of sugars from those yeast. Courtney?
or eating. No meat.
Yeah, you're eating the yeast is in there, yeah.
So it's not alive anymore.
No, I think after you bake it, it's dead.
Oh, jeez.
It kind of might die.
Olivia?
It might die.
Yeah, there's a fungus in it. Why? Mushrooms are a fungus. People eat those all the time.
That's nasty.
It's not the
You
cheese.
should never
the
eat
dairy
bread
product.
again.
These parts come from a fungus.
Not bread.
All right. How about in terms of so in terms of a nucleus, these fungi are eukaryotes.
Can I write eukaryote?
Yep. What do you think about obtaining energy?
I know this.
Eli?
Autotrophic.
They make their own?
No. He just said the
They
yeast
have to
eats
eat
it.
from the flour. What about mushrooms?
So it's heterotrophic.
Yeah. Mushrooms are decomposers. Yes, these are heterotrophs. I mean, these are yes, heterotrophs. Oh, they also have a cell wall. Interesting is that it's a different type of cell wall from a plant, but they have a cell wall as well. They don't have chlorophyll. They need to eat things. And what they eat is sort of organic matter. You think about like a mushroom in a forest. Where might you find a mushroom in a forest?
Next to a tree.
It may be growing on like a log that fell over. On my lawn at my house in our front yard, we used to have a tree that died. We had to cut it down. But we ground most of the stump out. But every single spring in that area, there's a huge patch of mushrooms that starts growing early in the spring. And they're growing there because those mushrooms are doing what?
Breaking down the organic.
Yeah, they're decomposing. They're breaking down the remains of the roots that are in the ground. And that's what they do. They secrete enzymes that break down organic matter, and then they absorb that as their nutrient.
Something fungi looks really scary.
So example, yeast, mushrooms, mold. These are all types of fungus.
So it totally
Plants are like have these flies.
Yep.
Would that be like considered
Still considered autotroph. Because it still makes its own sugar for energy. It's actually eating those insects for minerals. Because they usually live in mineral poor soils like bogs and stuff. Kristen? Yeah, like fly trap and stuff. Yeah.
Wait, I have
All right, produce. Let's continue on. Produce are, we'll spend a little bit of time after this section, but produce are unicellular. But that's technically not 100% true. So there are some that are multicellular.
Is anything?
Is that how you get twins?
What? You already know this from Mr. Lalonde.
What do you mean?
Like, is that those cells?
These are cells.
And you said if there's two of them.
Oh no.
I really don't pay attention
That's
to
not
health,
going
though.
on. We'll get to twins in the human reproduction section.
Yay!
We have another one?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yay!
Some are autotrophs, some are heterotrophs.
Oh, come on, let's go do it.
That's probably maybe a month or so.
What? Oh, come on, Mr.
Like
Lalonde.
one of the best.
is it a
Yeah.
separate unit?
I'd rather do it Mr.
Oh, the
Lalonde.
best. No, it's
No. All right, so there are heterotrophs, some are autotrophs, depends on the type of produce. And we're actually going to look at 3 specific ones, maybe next week. Actually, I have some in the mail for the regular 7th grade. They're being shipped here today, but Euglena, Paramecium, Amoeba.
What?
Those are 3 types of protists. Protists you find if you take a sample of water from a pond or a stream and look at it in the microscope, you find many of these single-cell protists living in that water.
Amoeba. Are we done?
Nope.
Subscribe.
All right, so we can probably finish up here. Bacteria. So bacteria are some of the simplest living things. They are unicellular. They are prokaryotes. They do not have a nucleus in their cells. Their DNA is just spread throughout the cytoplasm. And they are autotrophic or heterotrophic. It depends on the bacteria. Now, for examples, I just said bacteria, but we could talk about some specific. What are some types of bacteria you may be familiar with? Does anyone know a bacteria that causes a sore throat?
Ebola.
That's a virus.
Cold.
Bacteria.
I know. Streptococcus is a type of bacteria. Staphylococcus can cause a skin infection. Salmonella is a bacteria that can cause
That's from eating rats.
digestive problems, stomach illness. E.
Ebola.
coli. Those are types of bacteria. And then our last group, archaea. Archaea used to be lumped with bacteria. But scientists, after studying their genetics more extensively, found they're really not that closely related to bacteria, even though they have many of the same characteristics, like being unicellular, prokaryote. They actually got their own group later on. And so scientists often call many of these archaea extremophiles. They were found to be able to survive the most extreme conditions on Earth. Extreme salt conditions, very strong acids, high temperatures in the hot springs and so forth. Scientists thought nothing could live in these areas, but they did eventually find that these archaea were able to survive.
That's it.
Are we done?